The chandeliers were still settling when Anthony Bellaro made the mistake that would follow him for the rest of the night. He stood at the center of the ballroom like he belonged there, black tuxedo tailored tight at the shoulders, diamond watch catching every flash of light, hand resting easy on a crystal glass he hadn't paid for. The Connecticut fundraising gala hummed around him, donors, politicians, men who spoke softly and shook hands like contracts were already signed. Anthony leaned toward a cluster of guests just as the cameras drifted closer. "She'll take care of that," he said, tilting his glass toward the woman standing a step behind him. "She's with the staff." The words landed clean. Practiced. Casual. The woman didn't look up. She stepped forward and accepted a fur coat from a woman who hesitated half a second too long before letting go. The woman folded the coat neatly, slid a numbered tag through the lining, and hung it with the others. Her movements were precise. Efficient. Not rushed. Not embarrassed. Around them, the room adjusted. A laugh started near the bar and died halfway through. A man lowered his phone without pressing record. Someone near the back turned, scanning faces instead of conversations. No one spoke up. No one corrected Anthony. Silence settled, not heavy, but alert. Anthony smiled wider, mistaking it for approval. He turned his back on her and stepped into the circle, greeting a local developer with both hands, pulling him closer than necessary. He spoke loudly enough for others to hear. He wanted witnesses. He wanted proof that he belonged. Behind him, the woman continued working. She took coats. She nodded once to the event coordinator when asked about the seating chart. She adjusted a misplaced centerpiece with 2 fingers. No eye contact. No reaction. Just motion. The head of security noticed. He shifted his stance slightly, angling himself toward the main doors. Not alarmed. Just prepared. Anthony raised his glass again, punctuating a story that grew better with each telling. He laughed before the punchline, confident the room would follow. It didn't. A pair of men near the windows exchanged a look. One checked his watch. The other slipped his phone back into his jacket without unlocking it. At the coat rack, the woman finished tagging the last garment. She smoothed the sleeve once, then reached into her pocket and glanced at her watch. Not for the time. For the doors. Anthony didn't notice. He was already moving on, already shaking another hand, already climbing another invisible rung. He didn't see the event coordinator stiffen. Didn't hear the murmur fade near the entrance. The doors opened without announcement. No music cue. No introduction. A man stepped inside with the kind of calm that didn't need permission. Silver hair combed back. Dark suit, understated, worn like armor that didn't need polish. 2 men followed him, not close enough to look like guards, not far enough to be mistaken for guests. The room reacted before the sound reached Anthony. Conversation stalled. A server stopped mid-step. The head of security straightened fully now, eyes locked forward. The man didn't scan the room. He didn't look for donors. He didn't look for politicians. He looked past Anthony. His gaze moved straight to the coat rack. It found the woman. He stopped walking. For a brief moment, nothing else mattered: the chandeliers, the money, the speeches waiting to be given. The man's expression didn't change, but his stillness carried weight. The 2 men behind him halted without being told. Anthony felt it then. Not fear, confusion. A tightening in his chest that didn't match the room he thought he controlled. He turned, glass still raised, smile ready, and saw the man standing at the entrance, eyes fixed on the woman he had just introduced as nothing. The woman met the man's gaze at last. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stepped away from the coat rack and waited. Anthony Bellaro had learned early that silence was dangerous. Silence meant people were thinking. Thinking led to remembering. And remembering had a way of dragging men like him back to places he'd sworn he'd outgrown. So he filled the room with sound. He spoke louder than necessary, laughed half a second before the joke landed, slapped shoulders with the kind of familiarity that assumed permission. He made sure his watch caught the light every time he lifted his glass. Made sure the right people saw him standing where he stood, center of the room, not orbiting it. Every move was deliberate. He hadn't always worn suits like this. There was a time his hands smelled of motor oil and cheap cologne, when his name only carried weight on his own block. Back then, respect was taken, not granted. You learned to announce yourself or disappear. Tonight was no different. Just cleaner floors. Anthony leaned toward a state senator, lowering his voice now, letting confidence do the work. He mentioned a fundraiser he'd helped coordinate. He didn't say how the money moved, only that it did. The senator nodded, eyes flicking briefly toward the coat rack before returning to Anthony's face. Anthony noticed the glance. Good, he thought. Let them see. Let them understand the distance between who he was and who he used to be. Behind him, the woman moved again. A chair scraped softly as she adjusted the seating near the donor table. She paused to straighten a place card that had been set slightly crooked. The action was small, almost invisible, but the result wasn't. The table looked right after. Anthony didn't turn around. He felt better not seeing her. A man from a New Jersey construction firm approached, handshake firm, smile thin. They spoke about zoning issues and timelines. Anthony nodded, agreed, promised introductions he wasn't sure he could still make. Each promise stacked another weight on his chest, but he didn't slow down. Stopping meant catching up to himself. The room, meanwhile, kept shifting. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps. No open confrontation. Just a subtle tightening. Conversations shortened. Laughter came later than expected, or not at all. People began to choose where they stood more carefully. Anthony mistook it for nerves. They're watching, he told himself. They're measuring. Good. He raised his glass again, this time toward a small cluster near the stage. We're all here for the same reason, he said, broad and generous. Community. Progress. A few glasses lifted. Not all. The woman stepped away from the coat area and crossed the room with a tray of champagne flutes. She navigated bodies without brushing against anyone, timing her steps to openings that appeared just as she reached them. When a donor reached for a glass, she held the tray steady. When another hesitated, she waited without prompting. Anthony saw her reflection briefly in the mirrored wall behind the bar. She didn't look like staff. That irritated him. He turned sharply, gesturing toward the bar, signaling for another drink. The bartender hesitated, just a fraction, before pouring. Anthony pretended not to notice. He never liked fractions. He leaned closer to the construction man. You know how it is, he said, lowering his voice again. People think appearances don't matter. They do. The man nodded, eyes flicking once more toward the woman as she passed. His expression wasn't judgmental. It was cautious. Anthony's jaw tightened. He took the fresh glass and laughed, louder this time, as if to drown out something only he could hear. He launched into another story, this one about a deal that almost fell apart but didn't. He framed himself as the calm in the chaos, the man who knew how to smooth things over. No one interrupted. Across the room, the head of security adjusted his earpiece. Not because of Anthony, but because of the doors. Anthony didn't see that either. He was busy proving a point that hadn't been challenged out loud. The woman set the empty tray down and folded her hands in front of her, standing near the edge of the room now. She watched the crowd the way a host would, not scanning faces, but tracking flow. She noted who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact, who looked toward the entrance and then away. Anthony finally caught her gaze. Just for a second. There was no accusation in it. No plea. Just awareness. He looked away first. The music shifted subtly as the band prepared for the next segment of the evening. A microphone squealed briefly, then settled. The crowd adjusted, bodies turning toward the stage, attention redirecting. Anthony felt a flicker of relief. Structure meant safety. He straightened his jacket, smoothed the lapel, and took his place closer to the front. This was where he belonged, visible, acknowledged, undeniable. Behind him, the woman didn't follow. She stayed where she was, waiting. And without realizing it, Anthony had already crossed the line where turning back would cost him more than pressing forward. The woman didn't move when the music swelled. She stayed near the edge of the room, hands folded loosely at her waist, posture relaxed enough to look unimportant. People passed her without apology, the way they did when they assumed someone existed to be stepped around. She let them. A donor brushed too close. She adjusted half a step, creating space without breaking her line of sight. A server whispered a question as he passed. She answered with a single nod, pointing once precise. The server obeyed without realizing why. Nothing about her demanded attention. Everything about her controlled it. From where she stood, she could see the full arc of the ballroom. The exits. The security positions. The small clusters forming and dissolving as people recalculated who mattered now. She tracked patterns the way others tracked faces. Anthony had moved closer to the stage. Predictable. He always drifted toward wherever the light would settle longest. She reached into the pocket of her black dress and touched her phone without pulling it out. No typing. No call. Just contact. A reminder. Across the room, the silver-haired man remained near the entrance, speaking quietly to the head of security. Their conversation was brief. The guard nodded once and stepped away, posture shifting from watchful to deferential. That was enough. The woman turned her attention back to the room. A fundraiser like this thrived on illusion. Everyone here was pretending something: success, generosity, innocence. The trick wasn't exposing the lie. It was deciding when it stopped being useful. She watched Anthony laugh again, shoulders loose, confidence on display. She noted the way his laughter came before the room's reaction, not after. She noted who laughed anyway. She noted who didn't. One woman near the front kept her eyes on the stage, but tightened her grip on her clutch every time Anthony spoke. A man by the bar checked his phone repeatedly, then stopped when he realized no one else was doing it. The woman stored it all away. A server approached with a question about seating. She listened, nodded once, and pointed, not to a table, but to a person. The server followed the gesture and hesitated. "You sure?" he whispered. She met his eyes for the first time that night. He didn't argue. Anthony shifted his weight, scanning the room as applause rippled unevenly. He was starting to feel it now, not fear, not yet, but resistance. The kind you couldn't shove past with volume alone. He glanced back toward the edge of the room. The woman was gone. Not disappeared. Relocated. She now stood closer to the stage, just beyond the first row of chairs, in a space that looked accidental but wasn't. People subconsciously adjusted around her, leaving a narrow pocket of air as if something solid occupied it. Anthony frowned. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, to reassert control. The silver-haired man moved. He didn't hurry. He didn't announce himself. He simply crossed the room along a path that opened before him without being asked. Conversations fell apart in his wake. Not stopped, cleared. The woman turned slightly, aligning herself with his approach. Anthony saw them now, truly saw them, and the words he'd been reaching for stalled somewhere behind his teeth. He lifted his glass, unsure why, then lowered it again. The band finished its piece. Applause followed, polite and fragmented. In the brief lull before the next speaker took the microphone, the woman reached into her pocket and finally looked at her phone. One new message. She read it once. Then she locked the screen and slid the phone away. Across the room, Anthony caught her eye again. This time, she didn't look away. She stepped forward, just one pace, placing herself fully in the open, no longer hidden by movement or assumption. It was a small decision, barely noticeable. But it shifted the room. People adjusted their stance. Someone cleared their throat. The silver-haired man stopped a few steps behind her, close enough to be seen, far enough to let the moment breathe. Anthony felt the floor tilt, just slightly. He had spent the night making sure he was visible. He hadn't realized visibility could be taken. Anthony decided the problem was perception. That was always the answer. If something felt wrong, it meant the room needed correcting. He had done it before, shift the energy, remind people who was standing where, force the moment to bend back into shape. So he stepped forward. He didn't look at the woman. Not directly. He angled his body so the crowd saw his profile, his confidence uninterrupted. He adjusted his cufflink, slow and deliberate, then leaned toward the microphone stand as if it belonged to him. "Let's keep this moving," he said, smiling thinly. "We've got a full program tonight. No one laughed. The pause stretched just long enough to register. Anthony cleared his throat and laughed on his own, filling the space the room refused to give him. He gestured casually toward the side of the stage, where the woman stood now, still silent. "Staff will handle the rest," he added. "We don't need distractions." The word landed wrong. Not offensive. Dangerous. A few heads turned sharply this time. Someone near the back exhaled through their nose, slow and controlled. A donor in the front row shifted in his seat, creating space where there hadn't been any before. The woman didn't move. She didn't lower her head. She didn't stiffen. She simply remained where she was, hands folded, gaze level. The silence around her grew heavier, not because she demanded it, but because no one knew how to fill it anymore. The silver-haired man took one step closer. Not beside her. Behind her. Close enough to be unmistakable. Anthony saw it. His smile faltered, just a fraction. He recovered quickly, waving a hand as if brushing away a minor inconvenience. He turned to the bandleader and made a show of nodding, signaling for music. The band hesitated. That had never happened before. Anthony's jaw tightened. He leaned toward the band again, voice sharper now. "Go ahead." The bandleader glanced past him, to the woman. Then to the silver-haired man. Then back to Anthony. He didn't play. A ripple moved through the room. Not sound, awareness. People stopped pretending not to notice. Eyes shifted. Bodies angled away from Anthony, subtly, instinctively, the way crowds do when gravity changes. Anthony straightened, heat crawling up his neck. He laughed again, louder, brittle this time. "All right," he said. "Technical issues. Always something." He stepped away from the microphone and moved toward the woman, closing the distance himself. Each step felt heavier than the last, though nothing physically stopped him. "Why don't you head back to the coats?" he said quietly, through a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've done enough." It wasn't a request. The woman looked at him. Really looked at him. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She simply stayed where she was. Behind her, the silver-haired man's expression didn't change, but his hands came together in front of him, fingers interlaced. Waiting. Anthony felt it then. Not confusion. Not irritation. Risk. For the first time that night, Anthony became aware of how many people were watching and how few of them were on his side. A man near the aisle shifted his weight away from Anthony. Another checked his phone openly now. Someone near the bar murmured something and was immediately hushed. The woman turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the silver-haired man behind her. A fraction of a nod. Nothing more. That was all it took. Anthony's confidence began to leak, not all at once, but in visible seams. He adjusted his jacket again. He glanced around, searching for a familiar face, someone who would meet his eyes and confirm he was still in control. Most didn't. Some looked at the floor. And in that stretch of silence, longer now, unmistakable, there was a moment that didn't belong only to the room. It belonged to anyone watching. A moment where nothing dramatic happened. No shouting. No violence. Just a choice hanging in the air: speak up or stay comfortable. Step forward or let the quiet decide. It was the kind of moment people remembered later. The kind they replayed and asked themselves what they would have done if they were there, if they would have looked away like most of the room, or stood still like the woman had. Stories like this don't survive because they're loud. They survive because someone feels something in moments like this and decides it matters. Anthony broke first. He scoffed, shaking his head as if the situation amused him. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. "You give people an inch." He turned back toward the stage, intent on reclaiming it, on forcing the night forward by sheer momentum. He didn't notice the event coordinator step away from him. Didn't notice the head of security subtly reposition himself, not to protect Anthony, but to contain him. The woman finally moved. Not back. Forward. One measured step, placing herself fully in front of the microphone. Close enough now that the lights caught her face clearly for the first time. Calm. Composed. Unhurried. Anthony froze. The silver-haired man stopped directly behind her, the distance between them closing until it was unmistakable. Alignment, not coincidence. The room leaned in, collectively. Anthony opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And for the first time since he'd walked into the gala believing it belonged to him, Anthony understood something he couldn't undo. The night was no longer his to control. The woman rested one hand lightly on the edge of the podium. She didn't grip it. She didn't test the microphone. She waited long enough for the room to quiet itself, for the last whisper to die without being asked to. Anthony stood a few steps away, frozen mid-breath, his smile abandoned somewhere behind his eyes. He was close enough to interrupt. Close enough to say something careless and loud. He didn't. Behind her, the silver-haired man stepped forward. Not into the light. Just close enough for his presence to register everywhere at once. "Before we continue," he said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried the way a judge's gavel did, not by force, but by certainty. Every head turned. Anthony felt the blood drain from his face as recognition arrived too late. He knew that voice. He had heard it once before, in a smaller room, over a table that didn't belong to him. The man's eyes never left the woman. "Ms. Elena Marrow," he said. The name landed like a dropped glass. A murmur rippled through the room, sharp, immediate, uncontrollable. A few people straightened instinctively. Someone near the front row went still, hands clasped too tightly. Anthony blinked. "Marrow." He turned his head slowly, the way men do when they're hoping reality will correct itself if they don't rush it. He looked at the woman, at her posture, her calm, the way the room seemed to organize itself around her now. "No," he said, under his breath. "Not denial. Calculation." The woman lifted her chin a fraction. Not in pride. In acknowledgement. The silver-haired man continued. "For those who don't know, this evening's host. The guarantor of tonight's donations. The reason this room exists as more than decoration." He paused. Just long enough. "Elena Marrow." The room reacted before Anthony could. A donor in the front row stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Another followed, slower, more deliberate. Heads nodded. Eyes shifted, not toward Anthony anymore, but toward her. Anthony's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered at his feet. No one looked down. The woman stepped closer to the microphone. The silver-haired man retreated half a step, giving her the space without surrendering alignment. It was subtle. It was unmistakable. She adjusted the microphone once. The sound echoed briefly, then settled. "Thank you for being here," she said. Her voice was steady. Not warm. Not cold. Measured. The room leaned in. "This event was organized to support initiatives that don't benefit from noise," she continued. "Only from follow-through." No one interrupted. No one breathed loudly. She spoke without looking at Anthony. She didn't need to. Every word reached him anyway. "The program will continue as planned," she said. But with a small adjustment. She turned her head then, just enough to include him in her peripheral vision. "We value clarity here." A few people nodded without realizing they were doing it. Anthony felt the weight of the room shift fully off him. Not onto her, away from him. As if something had been quietly removed, and everyone was relieved not to be carrying it anymore. He tried to smile. It didn't work. Elena stepped back from the microphone. Not retreating. Concluding. Applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, uneven but sincere. Not celebration. Recognition. The silver-haired man leaned toward her and murmured something Anthony couldn't hear. She nodded once. Security moved, not aggressively, not urgently, but with purpose. A quiet reordering of space. Anthony found himself no longer standing where he had been moments ago. He hadn't moved. The room had. Anthony looked around, searching for someone, anyone, who would meet his eyes. A partner. A friend. A witness to tell him this hadn't just happened. Most people were already looking away. Those who did glance at him did so briefly, then shifted their attention back to Elena. To the stage. To the future of the night. Anthony swallowed. He understood now not everything, but enough. The humiliation hadn't been accidental. It had been allowed. And as the applause faded and the next speaker prepared to take the stage, Anthony Bellaro realized the most dangerous part wasn't what had just been revealed. It was what still hadn't been said. The applause didn't end cleanly. It thinned, broke apart, turned into pockets of sound that died one by one, leaving behind something heavier than silence. The kind that stayed lodged in the chest. Anthony stood where the glass had shattered, careful not to look down. The liquid crept toward his shoes, soaking into the carpet. No one rushed to clean it. No one offered another drink. That absence spoke louder than anything said on stage. The program moved on because programs always did. A new speaker approached the microphone. The band adjusted their sheets. A server crossed the room with a tray held just a little higher than before, eyes forward. Anthony didn't hear a word of it. He felt himself being edged out, not physically, not yet, but socially. Conversations resumed without him. Chairs angled away. Space formed where he stood, an invisible boundary no one crossed. He took a step back. No one followed. Elena had moved to the side of the stage now, speaking quietly with the silver-haired man. They stood close, not intimate, but aligned in a way that made it clear decisions were being exchanged without ceremony. Anthony tried to catch her eye. She didn't look at him. He straightened his jacket again, then stopped. The motion felt useless now. He shoved his hands into his pockets instead, grounding himself, scanning the room for damage. A man he'd promised introductions to earlier was already deep in conversation with someone else. The state senator avoided looking in his direction entirely. The construction man from New Jersey checked his watch and excused himself, moving toward the exit without a backward glance. Anthony followed him halfway, then stopped. Chasing would look worse. Security passed nearby, not escorting him, not blocking him, just present. A reminder. A line. Anthony exhaled slowly and turned back toward the stage, trying to appear engaged, involved, necessary. He wasn't. On stage, Elena listened to the speaker with polite attention, nodding once at a point Anthony couldn't hear. She accepted a folder from the event coordinator without comment, flipping it open and closing it again in one smooth motion. She didn't rush. She didn't hover. She belonged. Anthony remembered, then, small things he'd dismissed. The phone calls she'd taken quietly. The trips she'd framed as errands. The way people had responded to her emails faster than his. The introductions that had happened without him ever being in the room. He had thought it was convenience. He had been wrong. A vibration buzzed against his leg. Anthony stiffened. He pulled his phone from his pocket, shielding the screen with his hand like it might betray him. One message. We need to talk. Now. No name. No emoji. Just words. He looked up instinctively, scanning the room. His eyes landed on a familiar face near the back, someone who shouldn't have been there, someone who hadn't been invited. The man met Anthony's gaze for half a second, then looked away. Anthony's pulse spiked. Elena stepped away from the stage and crossed the room with purpose now, the folder tucked under her arm. People parted for her without thinking. The silver-haired man followed at a distance, speaking briefly to the head of security as he passed. Anthony moved to intercept her. He didn't get close. The event coordinator appeared between them, all apologies and practiced smiles, redirecting Anthony with a gentle hand and a firmer voice. "We'll need you over here," she said, already turning him away. Anthony didn't resist. He watched Elena disappear into a side corridor, the silver-haired man a few steps behind her. The doors closed softly. Something tightened in his chest, not jealousy, not anger, fear. He stood there longer than necessary, nodding at nothing, pretending to listen to a speaker he couldn't hear. Around him, the night reassembled itself without him in it. Another vibration. Another message. He knows about the accounts. Anthony's mouth went dry. He typed a reply, deleted it, typed again. Nothing felt safe. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and forced his breathing to slow. Panic would only make him sloppy. Across the room, a few people laughed at something the speaker said. The sound felt distant, warped. Anthony realized then that whatever power he thought he'd lost on stage had only been the visible part. The real consequences were just beginning. And somewhere behind the closed doors, Elena was already dealing with them without him. The hallway behind the ballroom was narrow and quiet, the kind of space never meant to hold power, only to move it unseen. Elena walked without hurry. The heels of her shoes made no sound against the carpet. The folder under her arm stayed pressed flat, untouched. She didn't look back, even though she knew exactly who followed and how far behind he stayed. The silver-haired man stopped when they reached the conference room at the end of the hall. He placed a hand on the door, then stepped aside. 5 minutes, he said quietly. Elena nodded once. She entered alone. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee. A long table sat under fluorescent lights that hummed just enough to be noticed. No windows. No cameras. A place for conversations meant to stay contained. Anthony slipped in seconds later, breath shallow, jacket half-buttoned, as if he'd dressed himself in a hurry. The door closed. For the first time all night, there was no audience. Anthony opened his mouth immediately. Elena, listen. She raised one finger. Not sharply. Not angrily. Just enough. Anthony stopped. She set the folder on the table and opened it, laying out documents in neat alignment. Not for him to read. For him to recognize. Bank logos. Account numbers. Familiar structures arranged in a way he had never bothered to understand. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Anthony swallowed. You could have told me, he said, trying for calm, failing. You didn't have to do it like that. Not out there. Elena closed the folder. Then she looked at him. It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was distant. I did tell you, she said. Every time you spoke over me. Every time you decided I was safer unseen. Anthony stepped closer to the table, palms flat against the surface. I was protecting us, he said. You know how it looks. The room, the politics. She shifted her weight slightly, breaking his rhythm without raising her voice. You weren't protecting us, she said. You were protecting the version of yourself you wanted them to believe. Anthony shook his head, breath quickening. I messed up. I know that. But I can fix it. I can. You already did, she said. That stopped him. She slid one document toward him without pushing it across fully. Close enough for him to see the signature at the bottom. Hers. Tonight ends the way it needs to, she continued. Publicly. Quietly. You'll leave without a scene. You won't make calls. You won't try to explain. Anthony stared at the paper. His voice dropped. And after? Elena gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. There is no after. We discussed tonight, she said. He looked up at her then, really looked. You planned this, he said. She didn't deny it. I planned for reality, she replied. You planned for applause. The silence stretched. Anthony's jaw tightened, then loosened. His shoulders dropped a fraction, the fight draining out of him. I never meant to make you small, he said. Elena paused, considering him, not the words. You didn't make me anything, she said. You revealed yourself. Anthony nodded once, slow. What do I do now? He asked. Elena stepped past him toward the door. You leave, she said. And you don't follow. She opened the door. The silver-haired man was waiting, already moving aside. Elena walked past him without slowing. Anthony stayed where he was. For the first time all night, he didn't reach for control. He let the door close. Anthony left the gala alone. No escort. No confrontation. Just the quiet awareness of being unnecessary. The cold night air hit his face as the doors closed behind him, and for a moment he stood on the steps, listening to the muffled sound of laughter and music continuing without pause. He checked his phone. No new messages. That was worse. The following weeks didn't collapse all at once. They thinned. Calls went unanswered. Meetings got postponed, then forgotten. A lunch that had been locked in was rescheduled twice before disappearing from the calendar entirely. Anthony started recognizing the pattern too late to stop it. He adjusted. He always had. He took smaller rooms. Quieter conversations. He stopped talking first and started listening, though he wasn't good at it yet. When asked about the gala, he shrugged, laughed it off, changed the subject. The story didn't belong to him anymore. Money moved slower. One account froze without explanation. Another required documentation he didn't have ready. Lawyers returned calls with new caution, billing by the minute instead of the favor. Anthony paid without complaint. He sold the watch. Not publicly. No announcement. He simply stopped wearing it. The weight missing from his wrist felt wrong for days. He spent more time alone than he ever had. The apartment felt larger without noise filling it. He caught himself speaking out loud once, then stopped, embarrassed even without witnesses. At night, he replayed the gala, not the reveal, but the moment before it. The silence. The way the room had shifted before he understood why. He wondered how many times Elena had watched him perform and chosen not to interrupt. Weeks passed. Anthony took a meeting in a cafe instead of a private room. He arrived early. When the barista got his order wrong, he thanked her anyway. The habit surprised him. No one applauded. That was the point. He started therapy in a building with no sign out front. The first session, he spoke for 40 minutes straight. The second, he spoke less. By the third, he learned when to stop talking. He didn't mention Elena at first. When he did, it was in fragments. Observations. Facts. The therapist didn't fill the gaps for him. Anthony had to sit with them himself. He stopped using people's first names until invited. He waited his turn. Months later, an invitation arrived, not to a gala, not to a fundraiser, but to a zoning meeting in a municipal building with bad lighting and folding chairs. Anthony considered not going. He went. No one noticed when he arrived. No one cared when he left. That night, he sat in his car and realized something he hadn't expected. The fear hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape. It wasn't about being exposed anymore. It was about being seen and found lacking anyway. Anthony rested his hands on the steering wheel and stayed there long after the engine cooled, staring at the reflection in the windshield. For the first time since the gala, he didn't look away. The room looked familiar. Too familiar. Anthony noticed it the moment he stepped inside, the polished floors, the soft lighting, the low hum of expensive conversations layered with polite laughter. Another fundraiser. Smaller than the last, but designed the same way. Status arranged in clusters. Power circulating quietly. He almost turned around. Old instinct stirred first. The reflex to scan for faces that mattered. To straighten his jacket. To prepare the version of himself that knew how to belong anywhere as long as he performed well enough. His jaw tightened. This was the moment that mattered. A young coordinator approached him with a clipboard, flustered. "Mr. Bolaro, we're short on staff tonight. If you don't mind waiting a few minutes." Anthony nodded. Of course. He stepped aside. Not behind anyone. Not ahead. Just aside. As he waited, he noticed her. A woman near the entrance, holding a tray that was slightly too heavy for one arm. She adjusted her grip, careful not to spill. No one helped. People brushed past her without slowing. Anthony felt it then, that pull. The old calculation. The quiet voice that said, "This isn't your problem. You're here for something else." He watched the tray tilt. He moved before he finished the thought. "Here," he said, reaching out, steadying the edge. "Let me take one side." The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, thank you. I've got it, sir." "I know," he said. Still. They carried it together to the table. No audience gathered. No phones lifted. When they set it down, she smiled small, genuine, and went back to work without another word. Anthony stayed where he was. Later, during introductions, a board member gestured vaguely toward the staff. "They'll handle refreshments," he said, dismissive, already turning away. Anthony didn't laugh. He didn't correct him loudly either. He waited for the coordinator to finish speaking, then said, evenly, "They're doing more than handling refreshments. They're keeping this event running." The board member blinked. "Yes, well, that matters," Anthony added. The conversation moved on. No tension exploded. No victory followed. Just a quiet shift, almost invisible. Anthony felt the familiar emptiness afterward, the lack of applause, the absence of reward. It was uncomfortable. He stayed with it. As the evening wound down, he noticed someone across the room. Elena. She hadn't announced herself. She stood near the back, listening, hands folded loosely in front of her. Not observing him, observing the room. Their eyes met. She didn't smile. She didn't turn away either. Anthony didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply inclined his head, an acknowledgement, not a request. Elena watched him for a long moment, then nodded once. That was all. When Anthony left the building later, the night felt different than it had months ago. Not lighter. Not heavier. Clearer. He walked to his car without checking his reflection in the glass doors. Without replaying every moment. Without needing to know how it looked. For once, the choice he'd made wasn't about who was watching. It was about who he was becoming. The cafe didn't look like a place where anything important should happen. No valet. No glass walls. No hushed reverence for power. Just a narrow room in Hoboken with chipped mugs, mismatched chairs, and a barista who knew everyone's order by heart. Anthony arrived early and chose a table near the window, not because it was good, but because it was ordinary. He didn't check his watch. He watched people pass. A delivery truck idled. A woman laughed into her phone. Someone argued quietly about the weather. Life moved without him needing to be impressive inside it. When Elena walked in, there was no entrance. No pause in the room. No recognition from anyone but him. She wore a dark coat, unremarkable, her hair pulled back the way she used to when she didn't want to be noticed. She saw him, clocked the empty chair, and sat without ceremony. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Anthony felt the old itch to fill the silence, to explain himself, to perform remorse in neat sentences. He didn't. Elena wrapped her hands around the mug the barista set down. She hadn't ordered yet. He noticed that and said nothing. "I didn't come for an apology," she said finally. "I know," Anthony replied. That was new. The restraint. The absence of bargaining. She studied him, not unkindly, but precisely, like someone checking the grain of wood before deciding whether it could bear weight. "I've watched you," she said. From a distance. I needed to see if what changed was the behavior, or the audience. Anthony nodded once. That's fair. She let the words hang, testing them. Outside, a car horn sounded. Inside, a spoon clinked against porcelain. The world didn't lean in to listen. It didn't have to. "I didn't lose myself that night," Elena said. "But I learned something about how easily someone else can try to shrink you when they're afraid of being seen." Anthony's throat tightened. He kept his hands flat on the table. "I know," he said again, quiet, stripped of defense. Elena took a breath. "I didn't reveal who I was to save you. Or to punish you. I did it because I was done pretending that dignity needs permission." She met his eyes. "I won't pretend again." "I wouldn't ask you to," Anthony said. He waited. He didn't reach. "That's the difference," she said. "You used to." She stood, then paused. "Not leaving yet. Just changing the shape of the moment." "I'm open to rebuilding," Elena said. Slowly. Carefully. "With boundaries you don't get to negotiate." Anthony rose too, but kept his distance. "I understand." "Do you?" she asked. He swallowed. "I'm learning to." That earned him a small nod, not forgiveness, not warmth. Recognition. Elena pulled on her coat. "This doesn't mean access," she said. "It means observation." "I know. And if I see you reach for power at the expense of someone smaller, I'll lose this," Anthony finished. "And I won't argue." She studied his face one last time, then turned toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. "One more thing." He waited. "Change isn't loud," she said. "If it ever gets loud again, that's how I'll know it's not real." Then she was gone. Anthony remained standing, the chair untouched, the coffee cooling between his palms. He didn't feel victorious. He felt accountable. Outside, the street went on as it always had. No music swelled. No reckoning followed him down the block. Just the echo of choices, stacking quietly, one after another. As he stepped into the cold, he caught his reflection in the cafe window. Not polished. Not posed. He didn't look away. And if you're still here, if this story stayed with you longer than you expected, take a moment. Not for us. For yourself. Ask what you would have done if no one important was watching. If this story made you feel something real, you can show support quietly by liking the video so it survives, subscribing if you believe stories about accountability and dignity deserve space, and sharing in the comments what choice you would have made in Anthony's place. Some stories only keep going because people decide they matter. Anthony walked on, carrying that truth with him. Not as a promise. As a practice.